In this lecture, we will talk about the human skin. The skin, as you know, is the protective covering of the body, and the most important function it has is to prevent the internal tissues from desiccation. That means prevent the loss of water from tissues. Therefore, the skin is a waterproof covering which also prevents water from the environment getting into the tissues inside. It also helps in temperature regulation and storage of fat. The skin we describe in three parts: the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. Now, if you look at this picture, which I'm sure you have seen many times, this is the epidermis, the most superficial layer, and then the thickest layer is the dermis, and then underneath it you get the hypodermis, which is mostly fat cells. Now let's talk about the epidermis. Now, as you know, the epidermis is made up of stratified squamous keratinizing epithelium. It is basically the lining of the whole body surface. Out of all the epithelia, this is the thickest epithelium, and because of that, it gives the maximum protection. It has several layers, and the cells in this epithelium is also called keratinocytes. This name is given to these cells because these cells have the ability to produce the protein which we call keratin. Now, the keratin is sort of waxy-like protein which is the content of our nails as well as our hair. In the epidermis, the topmost layers of cells are actually dead cells. They are dead and they are full of keratin, and they usually are shed from the surface. Only the basal layer or the first layer of the epidermis divides and produces new cells. And each of the new cells which are produced gets pushed upwards progressively. Now there are two different types of skin: thin skin and thick skin. The thin skin has four layers: stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and stratum corneum. Most of the skin that covers our body is classified as thin skin. The skin that covers our hands and the top of our hands, our arms, legs, body, all that is thin skin. Then thick skin actually covers our palms and soles. The thick skin is different from thin skin because it has a fifth layer called the stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is located between the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum. Okay, so most of our body is covered by thin skin, and thin skin has hair follicles as well. If you examine your own skin, you will be able to see this. Then the skin on our palms and soles, as you very well know, does not contain hair follicles, and it is also, the color is different. I'm sure you see it almost like transparent. And that is because we have in our thick skin an extra layer which we call the stratum lucidum. Now this diagram actually shows you the different layers of the cells. We'll go from the bottom. So here you would have this basement membrane of the skin. Okay, and below the basement membrane is the dermis. And the first layer of cells lying on the basement membrane is called the basal layer of cells or stratum basale. These are cuboidal cells and they have the ability to divide. They will divide and produce new cells. And those new cells will get pushed upwards. Next to the stratum basale, which is usually one cell or two cells thick, you have stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum filled with several layers of cells, which are, we can call them keratinocytes. So they're slowly getting filled up with keratin. Then the next layer is the stratum granulosum. In the cytoplasm of these cells, you can see small granules, several layers thick. And then if it is thick skin, you have the stratum lucidum, which is again 2 or 3 layer cells thick and gives rise to this special layer which absorbs light and reflects it in a different manner, and that is why it appears lighter than the usual skin. Then on top of that you have another several layers, 5-6 layers of the stratum corneum, which is again flattened cells filled with keratin. The topmost ones are dead cells and they can be shed. Now let's talk in detail about the different cell layers. Firstly, we'll talk about the stratum basale. As I said, it has a single layer of cells. It lies on the basement membrane and has the ability to undergo division. So this division would be mitotic division. So if you look at a skin section, a histological section, in these cells you will see mitotic bodies, that is cells which are dividing. Then you also find 2 other types of cells, melanocytes which produce melanin and protect us internal tissues from UV radiation, and Meckel cells, which are actually sensory cells. Then going on to stratum spinosum, it has this spiny appearance because of the desmosomes that are seen in it, and these desmosomes cause a artifact during staining which give it this spiny appearance. So this is the thickest layer and it has about 8 to 10 cell layers, and these cells produce a lot of keratin. They also have Langerhans cells, which are derivatives of the macrophage system and helps in innate immunity. Then coming to stratum granulosum, this has a grainy appearance due to the accumulation of keratin in the cytoplasm of the cells inside small vesicles, and this is about 4 to 5 layers thick. And in this layer, the cells, the organelles of these cells start to disappear and progressively the cells get filled with keratin. Then coming to stratum lucidum, all of the cells are now filled with keratin and also translucency is given to this, and this layer is lucid because of that. And this is found only in thick skin, as I told you earlier, and there are about 3 to 4 layers of cells in this layer. Stratum corneum is mostly dead cells, and this is the thickest one. The thickest layer is stratum corneum, second one is spinosum. So stratum corneum has mostly dead cells, about 10 to 20 layers of dead cells, and these cells are full of keratin. There are no organelles, no nuclei, no organelles, and the topmost cells can get shed. Right? So the shedded cells, the cells which keep on shedding, will be replaced by mitotic division from the basal cell layers. Now let's talk about the dermis. Now the dermis, we can consider it as 2 layers, and the dermis has hair follicles, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics. The hair follicles, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands are all derivatives of the epithelium. The dermis, as I said, has 2 layers. So you have superficial layer, which has loose, irregular connective tissue and extends into the epidermis like finger-like projections. which we call dermal papillae. Dermal papillae, and this helps binding of the dermis and the epidermis together. Now here you can see the dermal papillae moving into the epidermis. So this part is the epidermis, this is the dermis. So the connective tissue of the dermis is kind of pushing into the epidermis, creating these dermal papillae. You also find Meissner's corpuscles in the dermal papillae. They are very fine sensory cells which help you to feel touch. The sense of touch is given by the Meissner's corpuscles, the fine touch. Then of course there are blood vessels, lymphatics, and also macrophages. Now this is actually a small cyst in the skin which is quite common. This is caused by the blockage of a sebaceous gland. In the punctum or the opening of a sebaceous gland, you can see this tiny dot here is blocked. You can get sebum collecting inside and then secondarily getting infected. And that can give rise to what we call a sebaceous cyst. Now the dermis has a deeper layer and that is much thicker and more dense. The connective tissue is dense, irregular connective tissue. It has a lot of collagen fibers that give it strength and also elastin fibers which helps it to stretch, gives it tensile strength. Now going on to the third layer, which is the hypodermis. Basically we can also call this the superficial fascia because it consists of loose areolar tissue and adipose tissue. The hypodermis actually gives a cushioning effect to the upper layers and also connects the skin to the deep fascia. Now if you look at this, you see the different ranges or the difference in skin color. Skin color basically depends on the amount of melanin that is produced by the melanocytes. Skin color is determined by your genes and also how much sun exposure you are getting. Now accumulation of melanin can give rise to what we call freckles or moles. Okay, and here these are freckles and this is a mole. Now vitamin D production is affected by high melanin content, and dark-skinned people who live in temperate countries can get vitamin D deficiencies because of underexposure to sunlight. So that is why when you were a kid, your parents probably told you to go and stand out in the sun around 10 o'clock in the morning, right? So standing in the sun, which is very hot, is not good for you. It can damage your skin and also cause dehydration. But standing in the early morning sunlight is good. So exposing yourself to sunlight is important for development of vitamin D in your skin cells. Melanin will protect the underlying tissues and the skin from UV rays, and overexposure to sunlight can cause destruction of these cells and aging of the skin cells. Right? So too much sun exposure is bad for your skin.